Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. He did it. Prime Minister Trudeau made good on his campaign promise to restrict travel for those who didn't get the mRNA vaccines. Starting October 30th, if you do not have proof of double COVID vaccination, you will not be permitted to fly out of a Canadian airport or board a via train. If you are unvaxxed, you will pretty well not be going anywhere. Remember, the land border to the U.S. is closed for all unessential travel, and if and when it reopens, it is expected that the U.S. would only allow vaxxed foreigners into the country. So just how do these new government restrictions impact us, Canadians, both home and abroad? How will these new measures impact travelers and snowbirds? And most importantly, how do these changes impact our charter rights? Well, joining me later in the program for a discussion will be Stephen Fine, President of Snowbird Advisor, and Richard Vanderlubbe, ACTA Director, which is the Association of Travel Agencies. But joining me now to share her legal expertise is Joanna Baron, lawyer and executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Joanna, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
Okay, so a lot to unpack here, and I guess what I'd like to ask you right now is what has been announced so far in terms of measures? What do we know so far?
So it's exactly as you described in the introduction. We know that if you're unvaxxed, you'll be unable to board a commercial plane or any plane or a via train anywhere in Canada starting October 30th. It looks like there's a 1-month grace period for people who are in the process of getting vaccinated, where you will be able to submit a negative COVID test in order to travel. But after that, the rules are very clear, although they haven't been announced or delineated. And the Prime Minister did say this past weekend that exemptions will be exceedingly narrow and, quite frankly, onerous. And that is more or less a direct quote.
Yeah, I heard that direct quote over the weekend myself. And he was quite particular to say they will be exceedingly rare and onerous. So how do these latest measures impact our Canadian charter rights? Obviously, you're a lawyer. You work for the Canadian Constitutional Foundation, a fine organization. How do you see these new measures impacting those rights?
Yeah, so Section 6 of the Charter provides every Canadian with the right to enter, remain in, and leave Canada. And that's pretty clear. And historically, it's been interpreted as pretty black and white. It's one of the collection of what are called fundamental freedoms that cannot be superseded by the Section 33 notwithstanding clause, which just basically means the government is kind of bypassing the charter for some period, to really simplify it. And so it's in this collection of fundamental freedoms that the courts historically have been very skeptical to defer to governments. Now, of course, we're in extraordinary times. Nothing like this has happened since 1982 when the charter was adopted. But I suspect that any legal debate will come down to Section 1, the so-called weenie clause, which allows government to say, this is justified in light of our directive for public health reasons.
And I think that's where the public is as well. They're saying, okay, yet again, we'll buckle down and take these measures. Some might, some not, I don't know. But there's some people who say, okay, we'll have appetite for this latest restriction, but you've got to show me the proof. You've got to show me that this is really what's warranted. So can we anticipate then that there will be some discussion in courts at some point where the government will have to provide evidence as to why these measures are necessary?
Well, you would certainly hope so, and perhaps we'll talk about possible challenges later. The thing that I personally, as a legal observer, have just been gobsmacked by is that in its communications around this policy, the government has not even gestured towards proof. They haven't explained why it's not sufficient to allow a COVID-19 negative test, as is already required, why air travel or travel in general is particularly prone to infection. As far as I know, air travel has actually been shown to be safer than, for example, eating in a restaurant. And so the government hasn't even provided the sort of like gesture towards scientific evidence, which is really disturbing to me as just an overall precedent.
Well, it's funny you mentioned about the jurisdictions, if you will. So obviously airports are federal jurisdiction, and I can understand that this is within Mr. Trudeau and the Via Rail's a Crown Corporation. So these are areas within his jurisdiction. When we look at the provinces, and again, there's this whole debate being waged at the provincial level where we see, like you said, the restrictions at the restaurant, where you see restrictions in schools, in hospitals, in sports teams. that is provincial jurisdiction. So I feel almost like we're kind of stuck in the middle as Canadians. We're getting it federally, we're getting it provincially, and sometimes I feel like I'm being suffocated here as a Canadian. But anyways, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments. I'm picking up my discussion here on the latest Trudeau travel measures that were announced recently. And joining me is Joanna Baron, lawyer and executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Joanna, just before we went to commercial break, we were discussing which rights of the Canadian Charter of Rights would be infringed upon or could be seen to be infringed upon with such a measures introduced. I guess my question is then, why can the government do this? If this is, in my opinion, very clearly infringing upon charter rights, how can they have the ability to do this? And maybe even why are they doing this?
So I think the second question is easier to answer. They're doing this because it's popular. Polling shows over 80% of Canadians support these measures. Of course, we have very high vaccination rates. So this is the type of issue that most people kind of are wishy-washy on. It's only a small minority of people who are extremely opposed. So it's popular, and in a sort of might makes right way, they can do it. Whether they can do it within the confines of the Constitution and whether this will survive a charter challenge is less certain to me, even though courts have been very differential to public health measures, which infringe rights. And my organization has lost many cases in the face of this. I think this is a bit different. I think we can imagine, because courts will always look at individual circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's not just in the abstract. So for example, I was reading a story about a woman, a Canadian citizen, who was vaccinated abroad with the Sinopharm vaccine, which is not approved by Health Canada. And so she would be considered unvaccinated and barred from leaving the country. And let's say that woman had to go and take care of a dying parent and was effectively trapped inside Canada. To me, that actually it goes beyond infringement of mobility rights, and it rises to the level of Section 12, cruel and unusual punishment. So I do think that the courts are going to have a difficult time justifying this.
Okay, and then, as a laywoman, I'm not an attorney, you are. I sometimes, as a spectator, look from the outside and say some of these processes just take a long time. If there is a challenge, and I believe there are groups that are coming forward to challenging, maybe President Company included, if there's a challenge to this latest measure, how long could we expect, or how long will it take to work its way through the court system? Will this be a quick thing, like an emergency injunction, or are we going to be waiting years to see something?
Well, I imagine, as you mentioned, the first step would be to seek an injunction, presumably with somebody with pressing reasons to leave the country. And then lawyers would press for it to be heard on an expedited basis. So I think that we could get a constitutional determination within 4 to 6 months, maybe less, but the courts are notoriously clogged.
You say 4 to 6 months. That to me is a long time. Maybe not in the legal world, but 4 to 6 months, that's a long time. Many relatives could be dying around the world for many Canadians who can't leave. Okay, interesting. Are we the only jurisdiction in the world that is imposing such measures? I haven't heard of any, barring any communist countries in the world, but are there any other jurisdictions that are non-communist that have such similar stringent policies?
I haven't been able to find any either, certainly not Europe, not the UK. I get the sense that I would not be surprised at all if Australia did the same thing, given their general posture. But no, we certainly seem to be outliers so far.
Okay, maybe not, and maybe not proudly so. We talked about potential legal challenges. Will the Canadian Constitutional Foundation put forward that challenge, or any other groups? There will be a challenge, you think? What does the legal future look like?
So we are currently looking for individual plaintiffs. And if anybody is watching this show and they would like to reach out to us, they can go to theccf.ca. But we will be looking for individuals who have extraordinarily compelling stories, either a medical reason that's not exempt or a very essential reason to leave the country, just because we know that that will be the ideal way to present the case before the courts.
And one area of clarification, so Canadians with this measure, if they are enacted the way they have been announced, they will not be able to leave through the airport to leave the country. What about re-entering Canada? Can Canadians repatriate to Canada?
So interestingly, it doesn't seem to affect inbound travel into Canada. It's only leaving the country. So that's a sort of wrinkle, but it just goes to what effectively the Canadian government is able to control. They can't control ports of entry of countries outside of Canada, but that seems clear. It seems boarding a flight or a train in Canada is subject to these rules, but not boarding a flight elsewhere.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but don't Canadians always have the right to re-enter their country if they're abroad?
That's true, although that right was significantly reduced over the course of the pandemic, as we saw with quarantine requirements, as we saw with testing requirements, which seem to be manageable in light of where we've gotten to now, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Joanna. We'll have to keep on this topic. Welcome back. So many Canadians spend their winters down south in Florida or maybe the Caribbean. We call them snowbirds. So how do these latest measures announced by Justin Trudeau impact the snowbird tourist industry? Well, joining me now to help unpack it all is Stephen Fine, president of Snowbird Advisor. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me again. I think I've had you once on before.
Yes, thank you, Tanya. I appreciate it.
Now, a year ago, we were talking about how do snowbirds get their cars over the border, how will they fly over the border, and now we're in a whole different ballgame. Now we're talking about how unvaccinated snowbirds might be impacted by this latest announcement.
Well, yes, most snowbirds are vaccinated, so they will not be impacted severely, but those who are not vaccinated look like they're going to have trouble getting into the U.S. because they're going to have to be fully vaccinated to fly out of a Canadian airport.
Right, and with no border crossings for unessential travel, it's not like even double vaccinated Canadians are able to take their car and just simply drive across the border, at least not yet.
No, that's the case. The border still remains closed for non-essential travel, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not, although those snowbirds who are fully vaccinated will be able to fly to the U.S., whereas those who are not vaccinated will not be able to fly to the U.S. because they won't be able to board a plane leaving Canada.
Now, I know many snowbirds, I don't know how many, you'd probably have the figure, but many snowbirds decided to forego last season because they figured there are too many restrictions, it's too complicated, we don't know if there's a new wave, there are a lot of concerns. Now, people are faced with foregoing yet another season. How is this impacting the morale of snowbirds?
Well, I'll tell you, last season we did a survey amongst our members, and by the survey results, we estimated that only about 30% of snowbirds ended up going away last winter. This year, early in the summer, we did another survey, and over 90% of snowbirds said they intended to go away this winter. Now, since that time, we've also had, a lot of those people expected the land border to open. We've also had a resurgence of COVID cases in the US as well. So I don't know that we're going to get 90+% of snowbirds this year, but I think it's going to fall somewhere in between the 30% we had last year and the 90+% that we heard were going to travel this year earlier in the summer.
Now, presumably, many of your snowbirds also own homes, let's say in America. The majority, I assume, spend their winter months in the United States of America. So they own property down there. They perhaps forwent going down to America last year. How does somebody who's unvaccinated, who owns property in America, how is it that they are now not going to be able to go to their second home?
Well, the rules go by who is vaccinated, not by property ownership. So that's really a determination that's going to be made on the Canadian side of the border. But there are also vaccination rules that are coming into play on the U.S. side of the border in November. We don't have a lot of details on those yet, but they have stated that they're going to require all foreign nationals to be vaccinated. And that's going to add another layer of complication because the definition of fully vaccinated in the US will be different than the definition of fully vaccinated in Canada. So snowbirds are going to have to comply with the US vaccination requirements. And where that could get a little tricky is when it comes to vaccines that are approved in Canada, but not the US, and even more so for mixed vaccines.
Okay, so give us an example. I would assume like the Johnson & Johnson would be an example of vaccine approved in the US, but that we didn't really widely distribute here. Is that right?
Exactly. And then you have AstraZeneca, which is not approved in the US, but the CDC did make a statement on Friday saying that they would accept WHO approved vaccines, and AstraZeneca is one of those. So by inference, we can assume that if you've had 2 shots of AstraZeneca in Canada, you likely will be allowed to go into the US. Now, the issue comes into play where if you've had mixed vaccines, for example, AstraZeneca and either Moderna or Pfizer, or even a mixed dose of Pfizer and Moderna, what's going to happen there? They haven't really made any comment on that, and they haven't really finalized their regulations or their rules yet for that. So we're sitting here waiting because that could affect a lot of snowbirds.
Oh, definitely. And I noticed that announcement from the White House was made on our federal election day. So I actually missed it until recently because I was busy doing election night coverage. But many Canadians may have been distracted, rightfully so, with our federal election. How will it happen in the United States? Like Justin Trudeau has announced something and it's going to be implemented, in 3 weeks' time. Should we expect that kind of ramp up in the U.S. policy, or do they just kind of announce something and then that's the policy right at that moment?
Well, there probably will be some sort of period. I mean, they've already given people a heads up by saying that they're planning on doing it sometime in November. I think they made the statement on Friday about the CDC accepting WHO-approved vaccines to give the airlines a heads up. Now, how they're going to enforce it and what sort of passport or evidence or proof is going to be required still is up for grabs, and we still don't know information on that.
Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion on the latest announcement of the Justin Trudeau travel measures that were recently announced and how they may impact Canadians. Well, we've heard from the legal perspective. We heard how it might impact travel for snowbirds this summer, or this winter rather. But now we're going to hear from Richard Vanderlubbe, who is the director of the Association of Canadian Travel Agencies, to open the idea as to how this may impact travel agencies and all sorts of travel partners. So thank you so much for joining me, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
So how is the travel industry receiving the news of these latest measures?
Well, with the vast majority of Canadians vaccinated and wanting to travel, anything that builds confidence for the majority of the population that wants to travel is a good thing. We think that when consumers feel safe on board, it's going to be better for our industry to recover after 18 months of no revenue and a lot of uncertainty. So generally, we are happy with the announcement.
Now, I've spoken to various persons who say that we don't know the details as to how this will be implemented, but it's a huge undertaking, especially for airport staff or the airlines, as to how they would verify vaccine status and whatnot. And I'm sure those particulars will come in the weeks ahead. How does something that is so almost bureaucratically onerous, how does this impact travel agencies? How would this impact them?
Well, I think the idea of the national passport and a recognized method for airlines and for foreign governments or upon arrival to verify is an important thing. To start with, where Canadians travel to in big numbers, so let's say down south into the US, if there's a lot of Canadians coming on board a direct flight, there's going to be a higher chance that they will recognize some of the provincial, they'll know the Ontario Trillium or a BC or a Quebec because that's where the flight's originating from. I think the challenge is when you're connecting in another country and you're one of 2 or 5 Canadians on board the flight. This is when this recognized documents are going to be very important. We know that some of the airlines are working with the IATA application that you fill this information ahead of time on check-in, and it just streamlines the whole process. So the idea here is the more complete it is, the more online it is, the better. There's less lineups, less humans involved in actually verifying documentation. Otherwise, that's just going to slow everything down.
Sometimes I think there's so many moving pieces. I can understand why Canadians might be hesitant to travel again, even with this latest announcement. Is this just becoming too complicated for the average traveler?
Before all this, we would consider our primary responsibility as travel agents was to make the disclosures at the time of booking, and be that details about hidden costs and information entry requirements. Now we're doing it until you get home.
Yes.
Because things are changing. And for the last more than a year, we've seen these start and stops where we're reaching out to our customers to say, hey, this has changed. This is the new information. This is what you need to do now. And a lot of times travelers are really just looking for the most direct path to A and B. They don't want to read a whole bunch of information and background. It's just like, tell me what I need to do and when I need to do it, which obviously is one of the advantages of dealing with a travel agent.
Well, I was going to say that. I know perhaps in the last decade or so, with the emergence of online booking, travel agents may have been relegated to the sidelines for a while, but now I can see there's going to be a huge rebirth, because if I'm looking to book a trip, I think it would be very complicated for me, or for many Canadians, just to go online and see with all the countries where I'm connecting, what my requirements may be, if you're vaxxed, if you're unvaxxed. Whereas a travel agent, it would be hopefully somebody who would just be able to distill it all for you and say, look, here's what you got to do to get from point A to point B, like you said.
For sure. And even more than that, consumers quite often going directly and saying, I'm going to buy this from the airline, I'm going to buy this cruise or this hotel, not realizing that each of those independent purchases all carry their own restrictions and they don't all connect together. And so you need somebody to put it all together to figure out, okay, well, if something happens to this, what does that mean for my hotel? If you just bought the lowest price that was non-refundable, no changes, now consumers are looking much more, they should be, at slightly higher fares that give more breaks for changes and modifications, because it never used to be that issue. It was just like, give me the lowest fare, that's the end of it.
Right. Well, times they have for sure changed. Well, listen, Richard, thank you so much for joining me today with your insight.